Hello all, and welcome to the first installment of the show, Lovecraft in October, where we will be looking at the works of Howard Phillips Lovecraft over the course of the month of October. Over the next few weeks, I will be reviewing some of Lovecraft's most iconic and significant works, giving a brief synopsis of each story while looking at some of the themes and techniques used in them. For the purpose of this series of reviews, I will be using the 2011 Barnes & Noble edition of the Complete Fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. Today, I will be looking at the seminal story and Lovecraft's most well-known, The Call of Cthulhu. Before we dive in, let's look at some background. H.P. Lovecraft wrote the story in the summer of 1926 while he was in Providence, Rhode Island. It would be during this time that he wrote some of his most famous stories, but Call of Cthulhu remains the most famous out of all of them. After writing the story, he tried to have it published in the pulp magazine Weird Tales, but it was rejected. Eventually, his close friend Donald Wandrei urged Lovecraft to try again, and in 1928, the story was finally printed in the February issue. Before we begin, be aware that this review will contain spoilers for the story. Proceed at your own caution. This story is split up into 3 chapters, each covering a different aspect of the story, which eventually comes together as the story progresses. Part 1, titled The Horror in Clay, begins with the narrator, Francis Wayland Thurston, as he discusses the idea of not fully understanding the full contents of the universe, describing humanity as being stranded on a small island and not intended to travel far beyond. These thoughts came to be after inheriting and looking through his uncle's documents after he passed away. While looking through, he finds a strange clay bas-relief with unknown hieroglyphs and a portrayal of some creature that appears to simultaneously be an octopus, dragon, and a human with a tentacled head, scaly body, and wings superimposed over a landscape with cyclopean geometry. Thurston looks over a document titled Cthulhu Cult, the first half of which deals with a young man named Henry Anthony Wilcox. Anthony Wilcox was described as a creative genius who was eccentric and had neurotic tendencies. Described as being psychically hypersensitive, he removed himself from the public eye. Wilcox arranged a meeting with Professor Engel, who was the uncle who passed away, to show him the bas-relief he made after having a strange dream of cities and dreamscapes older than history, asking him if he knows anything about the hieroglyphics. They maintained contact, with Professor Engel learning more about these strange cyclopean landscapes and regularly hearing the words Cthulhu and R'lyeh. On March 23rd, Wilcox comes down with a strange fever, and he alternates between a state of unconsciousness and delirium. And on April 2nd, Wilcox recovers but ceases to have these visions. Thurston finds more articles and notes suggesting that during this time period of Wilcox's malady, several artists and poets experienced similar cityscapes, visions, and unfamiliar sounds described by Wilcox. The notes also describe more events of hysteria and panic throughout different regions. Part 2, titled The Tale of Inspector Legrasse, focuses on Thurston reading over older notes from 1908, where Professor Engel had been part of a curious convention. The focus of the gathering was over Inspector John Raymond Legrasse from New Orleans and the curious statue he had with him. The statue was, of course, in the form of Cthulhu, and was described as captured during a raid on a voodoo gathering. Described as a statue of 7 to 8 inches tall, it bore the resemblance of a body with an octopus-like creature riddled with tentacles, claws, and talons on the hands and feet, and long wings on the back, squatting on a square pedestal. Even after a thorough investigation from the other members, they were not able to identify the statue or its origin. Only one professor, Professor Webb, was able to give some insight into other tribes that have worshipped something so horrible and similar. The inspector then describes his account of the raid. On November 1st, 1907, the inspector and a squad of 20 policemen went into a swamp where they came across a voodoo ceremony where the men were howling and dancing around a bonfire, performing some ritual with other humans as sacrifices. The police foiled the ritual and captured the cultists, taking them in for questioning, where the inspector learns about the great old ones who came from beyond the sky, awaiting deep below the sea. Part 2 ends with Thurston once again visiting Wilcox about the bas relief. He comes to the conclusion that his uncle's death was not natural, as he was killed by foreign mongrels after being pushed from the waterfront. It is now clear that Thurston realizes that his uncle died because he knew too much, and he worries that he may share a similar fate if he continues investigating. Part 3 continues with Thurston investigating reports from New Zealand about the return of a steamship, the Alert. The reports state that the schooner Emma left Auckland on the 20th of February and was strayed off course due to a storm on March 1st, after which they encountered the Alert and its heavily armed crew on the 22nd. A fight ensued between the crew of the Emma and the Alert, which resulted in some loss of life between both of them and a heavily damaged Emma. The Emma's crew moved onto the Alert and set sail, heading to their original destination. They came across a strange island, at which point several crew members died mysteriously on shore. Only 2 people, Gustav Johansson and William Bryden, made it out, and Bryden died for apparently no reason on the voyage back. The only thing that was known was that Johansson was disturbed when the Vigilant found them, and they had a mysterious idol with them. Thurston began to make some connections between the Cthulhu cult, the idol, and the dates at which these events happened. He noticed that the day the crew of the Emma encountered the Alert and the island coincided with the day the artists and poets began to experience strange visions of a horrible city with a terrible creature. He decides to travel to San Francisco to find out more about Johansson, learning of his home address in Oslo, Norway. He then went to Sydney, finding out that the Alert was sold and that the idol was kept in a museum, bearing a familiar and mysterious figure which was similar to that described in investigator Legrasse's report. He finally went to Oslo to pay Johansson a visit. Upon visiting Johansson's home, he found out that Johansson was survived by his wife, who informed Thurston that he passed away, but not before writing some technical matters in English. He met his end when he was walking one day, and a pile of papers hit him from the attic of a building, after which he was carried off by some sailors. Then he was found dead later, and it was determined that he died from heart complications, although no definitive cause of death could be determined. Thurston gained access to Johansson's manuscript and read through it on his return trip. Here, he finds out about Johanssons' arrival on the island, describing it as a nightmare corpse city with cyclopean masonry, with a single monolith which possibly held Cthulhu. Talk of terrible angles, impossible structures, and horrible hieroglyphs and images lined the description of the manuscript. Upon arrival to the monolith, he described what appeared to be a door, and the crewmen struggled to open it. Eventually, they managed to activate the doorway, with the aperture opening diagonally and revealing a dark void, an unbearable smell, and some deep smoke within it. Something appeared from the darkness, and Johansson describes that some of the crewmen died on the spot just from fright alone. A mysterious creature, a god, walked before them, snatching up 3 crewmen with one swoop. One member fell into an endless void, appearing to be snatched up by an acute angle that behaved like an obtuse angle. Johansson and Bryden made it to the Alert, desperate to escape. Cthulhu followed them into the sea, and Johansson came up with the idea to ram the ship into the creature in a desperate attempt to kill it. Bryden went mad by this point, and Johansson plunged the ship into Cthulhu's skull, describing an awful explosion resulting in noxious green clouds, terrible smells, and the images of goo, feelers, and other awful things all over. He then noticed that Cthulhu began to regenerate, and he left the scene shortly after. Upon reading this, Thurston felt that he learned some unbearable secrets that man was not meant to know. His uncle had died bearing this knowledge, Johansson met his end after his arrival, and now he knew that he would be silenced, since Cthulhu and his cult still live. This is a classic story. Even though it is fairly short, it has all these great elements and moments. It is very much a detective story, wherein Thurston spends most of the story reading articles, piecing clues together, and even going out to investigate some of the people. Even though this is essentially a mystery, Lovecraft still manages to weave in so many signature elements, indescribable horrors, shared visions and dreams, and mysterious organizations moving behind the scenes. These elements provide a unique structure of the story. Speaking of structure, the three acts of the story serve to build up to this thrilling conclusion of the story. Act 1 deals with the visions in Wilcox's bas relief. The chapter starts off by saying that everything is only confined to dreams and visions, which Wilcox materializes into a strange but relatively harmless work. By this point, that is all it is. However, Act 2 makes these events very real, with the introduction of the statue and Legrasse's testimony of the ritual and the cultists. By this point, the reader is intrigued by the rituals and the cult, and the fact that this cult seems to be global, as evidenced by Professor Webb's testimony. This culminates into the third act, where everything reaches a climax. The visions are real, the city exists within this realm of relief, and the statue of Cthulhu is presented by the living, walking god, and the cult, which was thought to be secret and confined to hidden rituals and backwoods, is actually carrying acts behind the scenes worldwide. It feels like a natural progression, which pays off so well by the end with the incredible, desperate confrontation between Johansson and Cthulhu. The story deals with a lot of themes of humanity's place in the universe. We are all so focused on our lives, and in some cases, that is preferable to knowing the horrors and mysteries that lie beyond. Early in the story, Lovecraft writes that humanity lives on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity. And this perfectly encapsulates that ignorance is bliss, and that perhaps humanity is better off being blissful. Anyone who goes out to investigate or learn more finds their end, but not before losing their sanity amidst the impossible knowledge presented before them. This is the reversal of the phrase, knowledge is power, where instead knowledge weakens you to the point of putting you into the clutches of the unknown, where nothing awaits you but oblivion. The only people who can truly survive this knowledge are the insane, who can handle it at the cost of their will, power, and sanity. It ends on a kind of downer note. Even in the face of unspeakable horrors, there is nothing that you can do, and ultimately, you remain powerless before these great powers that have existed long before you and will remain far beyond humanity's time in the universe. I really like this story, not just because of all the things that I described above, but because of Lovecraft's language. He tends to be very dense, and sometimes it becomes a problem to go through his longer stories, but this story is short and creative that it is not a problem. In fact, I really enjoy Lovecraft's descriptions. Even though these are technically impossible to visualize, the descriptions almost allow the reader to kind of use their imagination to put these things together, and what results in the horrible and impossible landscapes and entities that are partly created by the reader. This is greatly emphasized in the later part of Act 3, where the Emma's crew is exploring the island. Lovecraft writes, "Without knowing what futurism is like, Johansson achieved something very close to it when he spoke of the city, for instead of describing any definite structure or building, he dwells only on broad impressions of vast angles and stone surfaces, surfaces too great to belong to anything right or proper for this earth, and impious and with horrible images and hieroglyphs. I mention his talk about angles because it suggests something Wilcox had told me of his awful dreams. He said that the geometry of the dream place he saw was abnormal, non-Euclidean, and loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. The very sun of heaven seemed distorted when viewed through the polarizing miasma welling out from this sea-soaked perversion, and twisted menace and suspense lurked eerily in those crazy, elusive angles of cavern rock where a second glance showed concavity after the first showed convexity. It was, Johansson said, like a great barn door, and they all felt that it was a door because of the ornate lintel, threshold, and jambs around it, though they could not decide whether it lay flat like a trapdoor or slantwise like an outside cellar door. As Wilcox would have said, the geometry of the place was all wrong. One could not be sure that the sea and the ground were horizontal. Hence, the relative position of everything else seemed phantasmally variable. These passages really go at length to describe how impossible the scenery and events are, but yet the reader is still able to visualize the scene by letting their imagination fill in the blanks with what they deem to be terrible and impossible, and it makes the final scene that much more interesting and satisfying. Because Lovecraft is not just writing about this nightmare, he is guiding the reader through it and allowing them to make their own. This is a great and classic story. It stands tall among sci-fi and horror stories as a shining example of mixing a mystery with weird sci-fi, fantasy, and horror elements to craft a story unlike any other. It has inspired countless media, ranging from movies, books, art, video games, and role-playing games. Cthulhu has been cemented as an iconic figure in pop culture, and the language and structure of the story allow for many different interpretations of Cthulhu and relief that people can still come up with their own ideas of what these unspeakable horrors can look like years after the story was published. I first read this years ago in my junior year of high school, and I still find myself coming back to it time and time again, occasionally discovering new things and details within the story. It is such an enjoyable read, and the brevity of the story really works to its advantage to create a tense thriller. Well, that was my review for The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. If you liked the video, be sure to comment below and subscribe. I plan to turn this into a weekly series where I discuss and review some of Lovecraft's works, so if you have a suggestion, be sure to comment and I will try to review it. Thank you all for watching. See you next time.